Women's News embarks on its third decade as the only global nonprofit news organization reporting on the most crucial issues impacting women and girls around the world so that we may continue to shape how women and girls are represented in the media toward creating a more equitable world that honors, respects, and supports the lives of women and girls by seeking the truth and reporting it, acting independently with accountability and transparency. Thank you for tuning in.
Women's courage and accomplishments have helped shape and inspire acceptance of the LGBT community for decades, yet their contribution to the community have long been overlooked. Women's News, the award-winning global news organization, is excited to provide a platform to tell the stories of these inspiring women that helped pave the way and those who continue to strengthen and vitalize the LGBTQ community. Welcome to Where the L Are the Women. My guest today, Leslie Cohen, is the author of the memoir, The Audacity of a Kiss. She grew up in Queens and holds a master's degree in art history. Leslie, along with her wife, Beth, is the model for the sculpture Gay Liberation by George Segal, which resides in Greenwich Village across from the Stonewall Inn. In 1976, Leslie and three friends opened Sahara, a groundbreaking, elegant women's nightclub in New York City. Leslie, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So I just finished the last couple of nights your fabulous book, which is just so amazing. I really felt like I was just in that moment, in that 1976 club, totally envious of the freedom and liberation that was happening at that time. And one of the things that really struck me was in the postscript of your book, you posed a poignant question. It was a question that really aligns with the mission of this podcast on the significance of Sahara and its importance to lesbians and feminists at the time. You asked, why don't more people know about it? So I wanted to ask you, do you feel that gender discrimination really establishes that women's experiences are less valuable than men's in the gay community?
I definitely do. I definitely do. I mean, listen, I'm talking again about, this was done in 1976, and I can tell you that the club was opened in 1976. And for 30 years after that, there was not one mention of Sahara in any literature. And it just frustrated me because it really was a groundbreaking club in so many ways. I mean, especially since before that, the clubs were mafia owned. Mm-hmm. That's the way it had to be because up until 1974, the DSM delegated queer people as mentally ill. So this was a groundbreaking club. And the fact, and it would frustrate me to no end, that no one mentioned it. And with all the people that came to this club and, all the celebrities and all the important women feminists at the time and gay and lesbian leaders, that it wasn't included in any literature. So yes, I really felt, as I would be reading articles in different journals and magazines mentioning all the great clubs of the 70s, like Studio and, all the men's clubs, the Saint and blah, 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 which were, of course, very different clubs than Sahara in many ways. They were grandiose, very large clubs that held, probably thousands of people as opposed to hundreds. But I felt that they were being acknowledged in a way that Sahara wasn't, because Sahara was as significant in other ways for women as these clubs were for gay men and the cisgender community. So that was very frustrating to me. And I tried to understand why that was. And I really do think that women's experiences are not as valued as men or the heterosexual community.
Which is why we want to, we wanted to start this podcast, why we wanted to elevate these stories so that they don't kind of die on the vine, so that we can continue to recognize the role that women have played in this community, because it is so often overshadowed by the, by men's contributions.
Yes. And that's a historical given, we know that's the way it's been throughout history. And so you have to kind of dig now to find out about what women contributed, or what their lives were like, or what made them who they were at the time. You have to really dig and dig. And I didn't want that anymore. I don't want to have to dig. I don't want to have to be on the pile of forgotten history, so that's why I wrote it.
One of the things that really kind of struck me as well was, you were in your 20s. Like, this was not, you're not a fully evolved woman at the time when you decided to take on this mammoth task, which it was a mammoth task at the time, to open your own club along with 3 other women. Now, for anybody not of that generation, it was very challenging, right? In terms of, acquiring credit. Women were not allowed to apply for credit, and you needed a man to co-sign your liquor application. But you continue to be persistent because, from what I read in the book, your experiences of women's bars and, entertainment areas that were set aside for, particularly for gay women, were just lackluster, almost dive bar-esque by comparison. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Well, this is interesting. I really have to give credit to my partner, Michelle Floria. All right. She was the engine that really got this going. I mean, this was a kind of woman that was aggressive, all right, and fearless. Now, I was in the art world. So I was a curator, all right, at the time. And so intellectually, I had all these ideas, but I could not have done this without somebody with a lot of gumption, right? A lot of gumption. And Michelle was that person with that kind of drive, and nothing would stop her. At times I would think it was totally unrealistic, but she just kept going. And we included 2 of our other friends, Linda Goldfarb and Barbara Russo. So that kind of group mentality fostered each other during our, when we would have doubts or anything like that. But it kept happening. It kept unfolding, even at times when we thought it would never happen. It took another step forward. And again, I really credit Michelle for that. She's a ball of fire and still a very, very close friend of mine. So she got it going. And then when it happened, I kind of stepped in more at that point than any other point to embody my ideas and my thoughts, which were based a lot on what I had read in my art history experience, which was to foster this kind of salon, also lots of dancing and music and craziness and all the other stuff that comes with club life. But to add that extra layer of politics and art and live performance. So it was a group effort. It was a group effort, and we supported each other during our times of weakness.
So you have this beautiful place. It's sophisticated. There's fine art on the wall, some of which, the artists would go on to be very accomplished artists of the 21st century. And, you have this beautiful, beautiful location. There's dancing, there's live performances, but you wanted something more. You wanted it to become more of a movement. It was a meeting with Alex Cooker, I think her name was.
Alex Cooker, another person who I'm very indebted to. Yes.
So it was a meeting with Alex that where you would discuss the possibility of bringing some political fundraisers to the event that included the likes of Elaine Noble, Gloria Steinem, Gilda Radner, Patti Smith. What kind of transpired during these times, and what was the temperature like? How were these events kind of received by the guests at Sahara?
Well, it was interesting because this was the second wave of feminism. But in the late 60s and early 70s, when this came about, it was more of a radical fringe. You know, there were moderates, of course, like Gloria and Betty Friedan, but it was also, you know, the radical fringe that got a lot of attention, and oftentimes negative attention, you know, as man-haters or whatever. But we wanted to bring the ideas into a more broadened audience. And by bringing these political people into the club and doing these benefits, we were able to expand the audience to women who may not have been, you know, totally cognizant of what was going on, but in their hearts and souls felt the camaraderie with feminist ideas. So it was the same thing with hanging the art on the walls. You know, you didn't have people who were necessarily familiar with it, but just by a kind of like what's the word? You know, just like amorphosized into
Osmosis.
Osmosis, thank you. They started to feel the greatness of the art, even though they didn't quite understand it. So that's what would happen with the politics. If we brought in, if we did a benefit for Elaine Noble or for Carol Bellamy, who ran for city council president, and we'd have these people come in and they would talk to everybody, everybody felt it. But I mean, really what brought the crowds in, of course, was the names. Mm. It wasn't the politics per se. It was that Jane Fonda was appearing at the club, you know, and they had to see Jane Fonda. But through osmosis, they started to understand what was going on, and they started to incorporate these ideas into their lives. And that was our goal. So I could actually see, which is what I loved about the club, women of all walks, of all economic strata, of every different kind of women together in this club, receiving these new ideas and watching this transformation from the radical left moving into a broader audience. And that was my purpose. I mean, I really, really loved it. I use an example in the book about Patti Smith, you know, yes, where Patti Smith gets up. And I mean,
I was going to just check if I was allowed to use the T words, or if I could actually.
I know. Can I?
You might need to bleep it, but I think we can say. I think we can say it.
All right, you'll bleep it, but I think they'll get it. So here we are, right? We're in this moment of transformation in terms of feminism, and Patti Smith gets up on the stage, and we have a lot of radical lesbians in the audience who've come to see this event. And Patti Smith reads from her poetry, and she starts to use the word tits. I'm sorry.
With a capital T.
With a capital T. And she's, you know, she's aggressive and yelling and blah, 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 blah. And the women start booing. The radical feminists start booing. And other women start cheering because the new generation is enamored with her boldness. And it's coming from a woman. So that objectification that radical feminists subjected to so much, which was understandable, was now being incorporated by younger women to say, look at this, here's one of our own. And she has the power, the self-confidence to be able to do this. And so it was, again, I was watching that actual transformation. Wow. Right at the, you know, in this small club with all these famous women there. You know, it was just remarkable. It was remarkable.
When I read that, I was, you know, I'm thinking about kind of the theme of this book, and the energy that exists throughout this book is like, you know, it's sex, it's liberation, it's drugs, it's disco, it's all of these things that it surprised me to hear the life kind of be sucked out of the room when she comes and so boldly starts yelling tits. Like, yes. It just didn't necessarily compute that would be the case, but you know, you framed it so well that it was something that had been used as such a derogatory term towards women by men.
That's right.
Throughout history, that it was revelatory to be able to reclaim that.
Yes,
exactly. And so exciting.
exactly. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. It was one of the highlights for me. I mean, I sat there and I watched it, and I just said, this is history. This is why I am watching history, the, the, um, the spread of these ideas and the incorporation into the zeitgeist of these ideas and the effect on the newer generation of women. We're still mid-70s, still big changes, still big changes.
It struck me that, a lot of the women that were attending these, and obviously it makes sense for the time, but a lot of the women were living these kind of duality lives. Like they were married with the children in the suburbs, and then at night they were coming to Sahara and having these love affairs with these beautiful women. There was one particular story in the book where a gentleman had come to us to retrieve his wife, shall we say, from the club. Tell us, share with us that story. It definitely gave me a laugh.
It was really funny. We were, one of our busy nights, we were packed. And these three guys, big guys, obviously straight, come to the door and say to the bouncer and the woman at our door that his wife is in there and he's got to find her. He's very angry and he wants to find her. And of course, we're not going to let three beefy guys walk through this club filled with women. So we said, look, we come up, our door person is hysterical. She's like a nervous wreck. And she's saying, you have to come up. They're here, they're pushing their way in. So we come up and we say, look, we can't let you in, obviously, three of you. So why don't we do this? Why don't you tell us who she is? We'll go look for her. And if she's there, we'll tell her, you're here. So we go up, of course, we see her, and dancing hot with another woman on the dance floor, all over each other. And we go up to her and we say, your husband is at the door. And she is freaked out. And she said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I said, all right, this is what we're going to do. Or one of us said it. We're going to hide you in the stairwell. We had an exit stairway to the outside from, fire exit. We'll hide you there. And we'll tell him we couldn't find you. She said, okay. So we hide her in the stairwell. We go back down to the guys. We say, look, we can't find her. If you want, we can escort one of you through and, the other, both of you wait here. We escort the husband through. He doesn't see her. They finally say, okay, we're going to go. And we go on with our night and we're just dancing and carrying on and then it's the end of the night and everybody's like exhausted and the staff is exhausted. Everybody's gone. And we're sitting in the lounge and all of a sudden we hear somebody screaming, let me out, let me out. And it turned out that we had forgotten that she was in the stairwell. So we had went up, we let her out, she was all bedraggled. But anyway, so, we had stories like that. We really did. I mean, a lot of these women were very closeted. Most of us were closeted then. This was 70s. There was the fear of losing your job, losing your children. So everybody was pretty closeted. I mean, the fact that we opened the club brought us out of the closet in a big way, which is one of the reasons that I got to model for the sculpture, because I was out when many people weren't. And that's, but there were a lot of stories like that, a lot of fun, a lot of hysteria, a lot of camaraderie, a lot of love between
How
all
great
of us.
for women to have this sanctuary, this refuge in the midst of a time when it was just so against, social experience to be out and homosexual. And so many of these women in your book have, like have these families at home, these husbands, these children, and then they come and live this dual life in Sahara. It must have felt so fulfilling to them to have a safe space to go at the time.
It was such a sense of freedom and love. And I have such a deep love for the community, what existed in this space, like I describe in the book as you're in this space and you're safe and you're allowed to be whoever you are. And then at the end of the night, you open that door and you go out back into the world, you know, with those Second Avenue noise and the air hitting you in the face and the light coming in from the break of dawn, you know. And but for all those hours, you were allowed to exist as who you truly were amongst a community that loved you. You know, it was such a feeling of love, you know, it would elevate me. It would really elevate me. It was very spiritual in its way.
So in the 80s, we went on to have approximately 200 lesbian bars in the United States. Now, in 2021, there's only 15 left. You know, in many ways, that's because we're no longer deemed a fringe group. You know, we're no longer outsiders. But with this, do we lose our ability to inspire change and to push for the continued feminist and LGBTQ rights that matter so deeply?
You know, I always, they did the Lesbian Bar Project, you know, when we were made aware of how few lesbian bars there were left. And, you know, I was interviewed a few times, and I just felt, and I still feel this way, there is nothing like going to a bar where it's all women.
Hmm.
You know, I just love that feeling because I love women. You know, listen, I used to, at Sahara, we would be a women's club, but we would always allow them to bring male guests, especially if they were gay guys. You know, with straight men, I was a little more cautious because I didn't want that sexual innuendo in any way, you know, any kind of threat to them, to women. But to have an all-women space, I mean, it's just a feeling that, first of all, I don't understand how women could not want that. I mean, don't you want to go to a place, and I'm talking, you know, in terms of cruising, don't you want to go to a place where you know who you're cruising and that, you know what you're getting or you're not getting? I mean, I don't understand. You want to dance, you want to hold, you want to party, you want to be with the other women. So I just don't get that on that whole, I mean, listen, so much about the club is meeting up and connecting sexually with another woman if you can eventually or whatever. But so, you know, I just think the need for community to me is just, you know, I can't imagine why they're not being lesbian clubs, you know, or women clubs. You know, I always considered Sahara Club for women. I was very much a feminist, even more than I was, I would say, a fighter for gay and lesbian rights. I really felt that women were all welcome at the club. And, you know, of course, the majority were lesbians, but as we could see from the benefits and stuff, a lot of straight women took advantage of it. So, and that's what I wanted.
You talked about Sahara existing at that intersection of gay liberation and feminism, but initially lesbians were rejected by, you know, a lot of the feminist movements, especially the National Organization of Women, calling lesbians Lavender Menaces.
Yes.
Do you believe, which is awful and so loaded, but do you believe that Sahara's mere existence helped to kind of assimilate that wave of feminist concepts?
Yeah, you know, Rachel, I think that when new movements start, and this is a controversial statement, I know, when new movements start, they want to distance themselves from what they consider the radical. And it happens every time there's a new movement. So, you know, Betty Friedan, you know, who was one of the founders of NOW and, you know, wrote her classic book in 1967, felt that lesbians were a detriment to the acceptance of feminism on a broad scale. That you know, maybe because of the radical lesbians, that the public, the broad public who they were trying to win over, would say, hey, These are man haters. I'm not supporting this. This happens over and over again. But as time progresses and these ideas become more acceptable, the radicals, what we began as the radicals, who are always the forefront of all of these movements, integrate with the broader movement. So here we have, for an example, Betty Friedan creating this idea of the Lavender Menace, and then coming to Sahara to appear for these benefits.
Mhm.
And it was only a few months later that at the National Women's Conference, I think it was like 2 months after she was at Sahara, that she apologized for calling lesbians the Lavender Menace and fully accepted them into the women's movement. I mean, it was these lesbians who were at the forefront of the beginning of feminism. So this happens over and over again. It was Jean O'Leary, who was one of the major, and a wonderful woman, one of the major forerunners of the gay and lesbian movement, who didn't accept transsexuals or transvestites, initially, and then apologized. It's just because you didn't want to, they didn't want the movement to be characterized by the extreme, what they consider the extreme, as opposed. And now, of course, it's totally embraced. We were all fighting for transsexual rights. And so this is just an evolution that happens slowly with every movement, it seems to me. The gay rights movement, Stonewall. This was started by a fringe element of the gay and lesbian community. These were considered the outcasts, the people who didn't have jobs, the street kids, Did we want, when the movement started to formalize, and did we want these people represented as the forefront? No, this was the Marsha Johnsons, all these people.
Yep.
And this is what happens. And then we finally get past that because it is accepted on a broader level. But it's, I know it's controversial for me to even discuss that, to acknowledge the fact that people are put to the sidelines who are so important to the beginnings of these movements. They're shoved away because they're not going to appeal to the broad cisgender audience that we're trying to win over.
Yeah.
But eventually, it comes around. It just has to take time.
It speaks to the power of visibility, right? And the importance of visibility, why we need to bring allyships into our world so that they can, people are influenced and opinions change when they experience, a gay person or a lesbian and have a human experience as opposed to what media is telling them. And it seems that that's what happened at Sahara on so many occasions.
That's exactly it. We were able to bring the media in, even though we have always had and I talk about this in the book, we always had a walk a very fine tightrope, because obviously my goal was to make queerness more visible.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I had to protect my clients because if they were outed in public, they could lose their jobs or their children. This was really scary stuff. In terms of the sculpture, again, like I said, I opened this club. I came out in a very big way. But initially, David, who worked at the Sidney Janis Gallery, which was where George Segal was represented, said, would you model with this other woman, who I knew? She was a professor of art history, and I knew her well. She was a wonderful woman, but she was frightened that she would lose her job. And so when I suggested Beth, who I was in love with, and we were together, and I said, listen, he said, she was more than willing to say, sure, do it. I don't really want to do it,
And thank goodness it was Beth, not
God
this other woman.
Otherwise I wouldn't have written this book.
Right, exactly. Les, I want to take you back a little to the earlier days before the pre-Sahara days. And one of the things that I was struck by is you have this boldness and this fearlessness throughout the book, but at the same time, it's juxtaposed with your fear of heartache and sometimes your fear of acceptance. You shared early on in the book that you grew up with a father that was often absent, spending some time in prison, having extramarital affairs. And it brought to mind the quote by Mary Gordon about how a fatherless girl thinks all things possible and nothing safe. What impact did your father's absence and also your mother's resilience have on you?
That's a good question, Rachel. Boy, I think, well, first of all, it brought me, my father's absence, I think gave me an appreciation of what women of my mother's generation went through. And of course, it totally influenced me and other feminists down the line, because there must have been a lot of other women who experienced this. That total dependence on a man for sustenance, for economic well-being, and sort of entrapped women. They couldn't leave because they had no skills. They had no ability to take care of themselves and their children at the same time. They were trapped. I think that instilled in me a real sense of the unfairness of what it was for women in our society. And I still see it. You know, we can see it now with the pandemic, and that it's these women who have worked so hard in their careers, having to leave their careers to go home and take care for their children. So here's my mother with 2 kids, a man who's unfaithful, you know, and she really was too frightened to do anything. You know, she couldn't do anything really. She had no skills. And then I would see when my parents finally separated and got divorced, I got to know other women who were friends of my mother. It was a very small group then, because back in the 60s, people didn't get divorced very readily. It was very infrequent and very rare, and it was kind of shameful. It wasn't something I shared with friends or anything about the problems that were going on in my home. I was very private. My mother was very private. But I would see her friends too, and I would feel it was so unfair. Here these women were, they brought up these families, they worked and supported their husbands as much as they were, you know, supposed to. They were devoted, they were loyal, and suddenly these men left. They just left. Some of them, you know, my father was not that kind of man. He supported us. But these men just disappeared and left these women, abandoned them with their children, and didn't pay for child support, nothing. And these women were totally unskilled, and they had to somehow pick up and make something happen for themselves. It just seemed so unfair to me, and that was a lifelong wound, I guess, or realization that there was such inequity amongst the genders. I mean, you know, the men ran the world, and it was so clear to me, and I felt it was so unfair. And also, you know, the fact was that I was in a sense, I was accomplished as a kid. I could do a lot of things well. You know, my brother, sweet, sweet guy, who's no longer around, was very damaged by my father. He was a very sensitive boy, and he was not what my father wanted. My father wanted somebody who was going to be a professional lawyer. He wanted somebody who was going to have an easier life than he had. And he focused on my brother, and I was left in the wind, you know, because he grew up thinking, listen, she's going to get married. She'll marry a nice guy. He'll take care of her, you know. But that's not what I wanted. Mm-hmm. You know, that's not what I saw for myself. And I often wondered, why does he keep talking to my brother, who didn't have the same attributes that I had, instead of talking to me? who was the one that was going to be able to possibly accomplish what he wanted, you know? And it was because I was a girl.
Mhm.
So that also struck me as like, oh man, this is, how the heck are you supposed to do anything, you know, except follow that norm of being married and having children, which I never felt comfortable with. I mean, I said, okay, I'll get married, you know, but I'm 26, I'm not married, I'll marry my best friend, you know, that kind of thing, which so many other women did. So, you know, that kind of stuff had a long-term effect on my sensibility about, you know, gender uh, inequality.
When you were trying to accommodate yourself within the perception of how women should move around the world and behave around men, you compared it to feeling like you were wearing an itchy wool sweater. And I really felt that. I really felt that emotion, that metaphor, just it resonated on so many levels. And I appreciated the metaphors that you used throughout the book, particularly the art-related ones. Another one that really stood out was you talked about a night where you had some breakthroughs, shall we say, with recognition of your feelings towards women. And you compared it to a Duchamp masterpiece that was delivered to a museum and then actually smashed. The glass broke. You used that metaphor to articulate your first kind of self-discovery that you may be possibly attracted to women. What did it mean to be able to break through your personal glass wall?
Heaven, heaven. You know, you think, you intellectualize on so many levels, you know, as an art historian, you're introduced to all these women who, well, not all, I mean, some who are written about or who were writers. And I mentioned Anais Nin and Colette, Vida Sackville-West, Virginia Woolf. You're reading about these women in the early part of the 20th century, and you're saying, wow, there are women out there who are really, wow, they were slept with other women. Oh my goodness, you know? And within the context of the time, which was really, this was the early 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, when there was this kind of revolutionary atmosphere coming out of the 60s, you know, of free love, and we started to consider these ideas, at least a small, you know, a group of us who were, you know, studying these things and talking about it, and we're friends, and you start talking about bisexuality, and, you know, but it's theory, it's theory. And then you say to yourself one day, when something like, there's a possibility that somebody comes onto you, another woman, and you say, well, why is it theory? Why don't I do this? I mean, gee, Colette did it. I mean, wow. I mean, these fabulous women, why can't I just let it go? You know, why can't I just do it? And you do it. And suddenly you become something other than what you've always conceived yourself to be. You become the possibility of being unusual.
Mm.
The beauty of being unusual, the beauty of being different, the beauty of being daring, the beauty of being possibly an artist, you know? And that's something that, if it inherently with me, whether I was an artist or not, that's who I always wanted to be, you know, in my deepest soul, regardless of the fact that I didn't have the talents, but that's what I wanted. So it was a sense of freedom, breaking down boundaries of like, finally, I'm free. Finally, I did something that's not supposed to be okay.
Mm.
And yet it felt so right for me. And it felt like, now, you know, it took time after that, of course, to like get to the point, you know, it's coming out as, you know, made up of many stages. So this was the first breaking of the glass.
I loved your coming out story with your mom, how you had this element of betrayal really from your brother, who essentially outed you.
Yes.
And you were so fearful about getting that call from your mother. You know, you eagerly await the phone call and have this sense of impending doom, but it was not what you expected.
My mother was my best friend, and I adored her. I could cry now. And it's been 30-some years, so you can imagine. She just was an incredible woman, extremely honest. She said what she thought, what she felt. There was just no bullshit about her. And so, yeah, I was petrified of losing her. But the truth is, there had already been a distance. I wasn't sharing so much of my life with her because, I was gay. So when I found out she knew, I was so frightened. But she had this ironic humor about her always. That's how my mother and I survived during these things with my father and him being gone and whatever. We used to laugh and make jokes, There was a song called Daddy's Home. I don't know if you used to go, Daddy's home. We would always sing that because he was never home. So that was the fun that we had together. So, there she gets on the phone. She said, so I heard the good news. So I heard the good news. So, and it just cracked me up because she was just fun. And that was it, Listen, yes, she always said, look, I wish you were, I would have liked you to be straight because I want to make sure you're taken care of. Which it's ironic in itself, since, she was straight. Look what happened with her, and with a lot of the men that abandoned their wives or children. Mm-hmm. So, but she was fine. And, she loved Beth, she meant, she was very much a part of our lives.
So while you were busy carving out a place for women to live, love, and liberate, you yourself were also falling madly in love with wonderful Beth, yes, your partner of 45 years. Now, your love story actually spans 5 decades, almost 6. So tell us about you and Beth. Tell us a little bit about your love story and what your secret to 5 decades of marriage is.
I met Beth my freshman year in college in Buffalo State. She was the first person I met, the first freshman I met, which was so crazy. She was absolutely magnificent looking. She was just a beautiful woman. Everybody, everybody would look at her. I mean, she was just gorgeous. And, you couldn't help but be taken aback when you saw her. And so we met and we became friends that freshman year. We both loved jazz. We both loved dancing. And so we would meet and dance and carry on and blah, 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 blah. But, again, never thought there was, I was basically, I didn't know what I was sexually. I certainly wasn't in any headspace where I could admit to being gay. I mean, that was just not something you would admit to in 1965. It was, you'd be filled with shame and just totally ostracized if that's who you were. So that was not going to be something that I was going to even entertain. But, I think a lot of my sexuality came out in dancing. That's how I expressed myself. And Bethy and I just had something. It was undefined because we couldn't define it. And it definitely was an attraction for each other. But who knew? I didn't know the words. I didn't know how to explain what was going on between us. But she, at the time, she wanted all my attention. And it was very unusual because I was very social. I was getting away from my family and the agony of that conflict in my home. And I was just wanted to party and fly and carry on. And I was always in trouble. I was always getting in trouble. And she was kind of meek and didn't want to, but I just made crazy things with her. We carried on. But she wanted my attention, and it kind of kept me I felt locked in, and she was obsessed with this guy who she had been with since the age of 12. And it just kept going on and on every time we talked. And finally I said to myself, I have to move away from her because I want to have a good time. I want to be happy. I don't want to be, and she was very depressed. So we kind of separated. And then in our sophomore year, I went off to Europe to study in Italy. And when I came back, she had transferred back to New York, to Hofstra, to be with the guy that she had left, and eventually she married him. And we didn't see each other for 11 years. We ran into each other very briefly, which was so peculiar, at a Morgana King concert. Now, Morgana King was a jazz singer. And the fact that, like, I don't know, whenever it was at Lincoln Center, I was with Michelle, who I was living with at the time, and she was with this guy, Stephen. After she divorced Lance, she was living with a guy, Stephen. And we saw each other. It was so appropriate that it would be at Morgana King in the Lincoln Center, because she was kind of an obscure, she wasn't a well-known jazz singer, but so anyway, but we really came together 11 years later when she applied for a job at a mutual college friend's garment showroom, and they recognized each other. That's friends from college, and we all had to get together. And we got together, and they all came to my apartment, my college friends and her, and I just was. Now I was out. Now I was gay. Now it was like maybe a month before I was going to open Sahara. She was with this guy, Stephen, and there was nobody in that room but her and me. It was so strong, the connection. It had never changed. It was always that way. But now I understood it. Whereas before I didn't. This was 1976. And long story short, she moved to Woodstock with Stephen, and I went up to visit her with my lover at the time. And she came to the opening of Sahara with my college friends. We all danced and I said, oh my God, I'm in love with this woman. But she's straight, so forget it. And but anyway, we ended up being together. She eventually left Stephen, and that's what happened.
45 years later.
45 years later.
Love for the ages.
Yeah, crazy for her. Yeah, she's my angel. She's my devoted, loyal friend, and there's just it's been really a wonderful ride. It's been a wonderful ride, which is another reason I wrote the book, so that people know that they can have a wonderful ride. There are young people out there who think their lives are coming to an end because they realize they're gay. But that's not the way it is, and it doesn't have to be. Just hang in there. Hang in there. You'll find your way, and there's a lot of joy. There's a lot of joy in being queer.
Yep.
A lot of fun.
I'll second
that. A lot of love.
So in 1979, the artist George Segal was commissioned to create a gay liberation public art sculpture to commemorate the Stonewall riots. And you and Beth were the models for the sculpture. And these sculptures have become iconic. They are visited by millions. Celebrities have taken photographs with them. But it wasn't until 92 that the sculptures were actually unveiled, because there were quite a few challenges along the way. Can you share a little bit about what you went through during that time, and perhaps fill our listeners in on the grotesque stereotypes?
I know, that was funny. We posed in 1979. It was so interesting because it was only a few weeks before Sahara was closed. So I always wonder if it was fate, it's like I'm going to take Sahara, but we're going to give you this, you know what I mean? I was friends, because I had been in the art world, with David Boyce, who worked at Sidney Janis. And I hadn't spoken to David in a number of years because I left the art world and opened the club. But David called me at the club one night and said, would you model? And I was honored. I said, oh my God, of course I would love to. And I, like I said before, I asked if Beth could model with me. So we went up to to George's studio, which was in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And we modeled. We went at the consecutive weekends. And then nothing happened. Year after year after year, nothing was happening. And we started to see that, there was, of course, objections from the certain people in the community, in the village, not in my backyard kind of thing. It was still a pretty homophobic society. And a lot of, there was a group of gay activists who also were not happy with the idea that it didn't represent literally the uprising at Stonewall, excuse me, because it was created, the sculpture, to commemorate the 10th anniversary of Stonewall, the uprising. But it was never meant to be a literal, scene of the battle, it was supposed to be a broader idea of gay liberation. And, but there were folks who felt that it should be inclusive of Black, Latin. It's the kind of thing that happens often when you do public art. You get a community that focuses on the inclusion of everybody, and that's very difficult when you have an art piece. With an artist that has a certain style and is seeing it from his perspective. So you oftentimes, you can't do what people want as a political statement. You have to get the sensibility of it on a broader level of love and inclusion. And again, like I said before, there are steps that have to be taken. That sculpture at that time, in order to be accepted in any way, had to be almost middle of the road. Again, it couldn't be a radical representation. What the broader community thought of as a radical representation, it never would have been accepted. The fact that there was an 11-year battle to get it in, the way it looked now, it should be exemplary of that fact. So, I think the sculpture is a beautiful sculpture, and I think it says so much, and and I'm so happy it finally did get in. But there was a lot of that kind of combativeness, and I remember when we went to this hearing, which is in the book, and somebody had written about us and called us grotesque stereotypes, which was the furthest thing from the truth. They were thinking of, the grotesque stereotypes are very butch, which, I'm not ashamed to say I'm kind of butch, but, but Beth certainly was not. And, David and the other guy also was not typical stereotypes, but they called us grotesque stereotypes. So we came to the hearing wearing t-shirts that said grotesque stereotypes. And then, I got up and gave my little speech and said we had the grotesque stereotypes referred to in the New York Times article, and everybody cracked up laughing, and but it was something. And then finally, I got the call. It was 2 weeks before we were moving out of New York to Miami, because I became a lawyer and I got a job offer in Miami, that the sculpture was finally going to be unveiled. And we all went to the unveiling. We had a ball. And David Dinkins was there, and there's a whole other story which I won't share.
I read it.
Okay.
Folks, you have to read the book for this X-rated.
That's right. This is the X-rated part.
That's in the outtakes. You can read Leslie's book for that story. It involves the subway. That's all I'm going to say.
I love it. Anyway, so because of that gentleman, we were like, became, David Dinkins and we were just hanging out, and it was a wonderful celebration. And my mother came, and she kept yelling, I'm the mother.
That really moved me when I read that, thinking about your mother's journey and thinking about what you've shared with me today, how she could never leave, right? She could never have that courage. She might have the courage, but it was so not a possibility for women of that time. And for how supportive she was of you when you came out, how loving. And to then support your relationship with Beth.
My mother also had this side that was very unconventional. She loved shocking people. This was something she just loved to do. She was very mischievous. Her and her sisters, who I adored, the three of them, were very mischievous. I mean, they just, they grew up in this time where you got married, you had kids, you depended on your husband. But they were so mischievous and so filled with life and love, But anyway, that's my mom. Yeah.
To stand there in that moment when those sculptures are being unveiled, and it's this poignant day, and you have your lover of many decades, your mother accepting you, and knowing that your life and love is essentially memorialized forever outside this historic monument. How does that feel?
Oh, I'll tell you, it's grown with time. It's kind of like at first you just don't realize the impact. You kind of understand it in a certain way, but not in an actual real way. And with time, it starts to become realer and realer. And you all of a sudden you go to, when we go to New York, we haven't been to New York because of the pandemic in a couple of years. But anytime we go, and we go to the sculpture, we walk by and we sit there and we go, I can't believe this. This is insane. It's beyond our imagination. And then if you tell anybody, if we go and we say to anybody that we were the models, they go wild. They go wild, it's just remarkable. And it's, again, I had to write the book. I had to let people know that this is a love story. It's just not two strangers. These are two women that lived their lives, and this is what we went through, and we're 45 years into it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Leslie,
56. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for the work that you did, for the hearts and minds that you influenced. You truly helped pave the way for women like me to live in a world where it's a little bit more okay to be gay. And, we have a long way to go, but we hope by continuing to tell these stories and, that we get to kind of preserve the massive contributions that women like you have made to this community so that they won't be forgotten. Leslie, the book is out now, folks. Go check it out. All right. This has been Where the L Are the Women, folks. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to the Women's E-News podcast. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe. And to learn more about Women's E-News, please visit us at womensenews.org. It's completely free to subscribe.